My name is Geoff O'Keefe. I'm the Executive Director of Zen Peacemakers. And just a really quick intro here. This is one of four classes that we do in this core trainings series. 2-3 years ago, I had the idea that we've got a 2-year intensive program for the Zen Peacemaker Order. 9 modules, meeting every Friday for 18 months or 2 years. And that's a heavy lift for a lot of people. And I thought, well, let's put something out that is accessible to everybody. Free, you can repeat, they're short, a variety of times so that Europeans and, North and South Americans can attend and so forth. So we did. So we have 4 of these. One is an introduction to meditation, introduction to council practice, introduction to the 3 tenets, which Daikan's going to do today, and introduction to peacemaking. And we repeat these. So we do 1 a month. So you're invited to take advantage of all 4 of them and repeat them as often as you'd like. And it is kind of interesting to see how different teachers present these topics as well. So I don't want to burn too much time here. So I'm going to hand it over to my friend, Sensei Daiken, Jim Bastian, and he will take us into the core tenets, or the 3 tenets, which are as fundamental as it gets with Zen Peacemakers. This really is our foundation. So Daiken, thank you so much for doing this from cold and snowy Maine. And I'll click myself off, but I'll be right here.
All right. Thank you so much, Geoff. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of, I'm sure, your busy day to spend a little time with us at Zen Peacemakers and review with you the 3 tenets, which, like Geoff mentioned, is kind of the core practice of our lineage. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to spend a little time defining the 3 tenets and then illustrating each of the tenets with anecdotes and stories from the Zen lineage, and then at the end, after we get through defining, not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action, I have a case that we'll work on together to see how the 3 tenets manifest in a particular situation. So let me start by saying that, Roshi Bernie Glassman founded the Zen Peacemaker Order. He was my teacher, and back in 1994, he developed what he called the 3 tenets of the Zen Peacemakers. Now, if you're familiar with formal Zen practice, at some point, people will request of their teacher to become a formal student. And if the teacher accepts them, then they train for a while, and then they go through a ceremony called Jukai. And during that ceremony, they take 16 what are called Bodhisattva precepts. And 3 of those precepts are known as the 3 pure precepts, which are cease from harm, do only good, and do good for others. So when Bernie was developing the Zen Peacemaker Order, his practice was very much involved in social engaged Buddhism. He founded the Grayston Bakery, and he started working with people that were homeless and people that were drug addicted, and basically the poor and low-income people of Yonkers, New York. And so his students were interested in knowing how those pure precepts could actually be applied to the work that they were doing, helping people that were disadvantaged in many ways. And so he took the idea of cease from harm and converted that into not knowing. The foundation belief here is that all harm originates in the mind, right? A harmful thought leads to a harmful belief, leads to a harmful action, which leads to harmful habits, which leads to kind of a harmful way of being in the world. And so by not knowing and not fixating on specific ideas, concepts, and beliefs, you could reduce the amount of harm that you would create in the world. And secondly, the way to do that would be to bear witness. And what does bear witness mean? It means being present moment to moment with the reality that's unfolding right here, right now, completely open, without a fixed agenda or set of ideas. And then the third pure precept, which is do good for others, he called taking action or taking loving action, which the idea behind it was that if you don't have fixed ideas and you bear witness and stay open to what's unfolding in the moment, that you will enter into a relationship in that moment with what is unfolding. And in that unfolding of that relationship, you will figure out what the best action will need to be moving forward. And it may turn out not to be the best action, but it's the best action that you come up with in that moment in relationship with others. So this idea of not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action is an algorithm that we use in the Zen Peacemakers continually as we're working and interacting through issues and our experiences with others. So a couple of things about Buddhism in general principles. So one of the most fundamental principles of Buddhism is the oneness and interconnectedness of all things, right? That there is nothing that exists independent of any or all other things. Our existence is literally the relationship with all things, okay? We don't often see it that way because our culture doesn't kind of view it that way, and we're kind of conditioned to think that we're separate. But in Buddhism, the fundamental principle is the oneness and interconnectedness of all life. That's number one. And number two is impermanence. What does impermanence mean? Everything is changing, moment to moment to moment. So think about this and step back into this kind of expansive view. Everything is interrelated, and it's all continuously changing. It's completely dynamic, okay? Who you were a second ago is not who you are now, and not who you're going to be a second from now, because everything is interconnected and everything is changing, okay? So, in the Four Noble Truths, some of you may be familiar with them. These were the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha articulated after his great enlightenment. And the first noble truth was life is marked by suffering. And he called that suffering dukkha, right? That was the word, the Sanskrit word for it. Well, etymologically, if you look at that word, dukkha, and you go back into the ancient Sanskrit, the word dukkha refers to the hub of a wheel that won't turn. The wheel is stuck. It's in a fixed position. And because it's in a fixed position, and the rest of the world is moving moment by moment in its dynamic unfolding, you suffer. Because to the degree to which you persist with this fixed idea, etc., you are now going against the natural order of the life in the universe itself. And that's where how suffering originates, in the struggle that we feel with the rest of the world, which is literally mostly of our own making. I'm not saying people don't do bad things and that, that we're the cause of it, but it's not what happens to us, it's how we react to what happens to us that determines, the path that we're on. All right, so not knowing is basically letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, others, and literally the entire universe. In other words, hold your stuff lightly. Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe yes, maybe no. Not absolutely. You better believe it, right? Maybe yes, maybe no. So that brings me to kind of a very famous Zen story. This is the story of Bodhi and Emperor Wu of China. So back around 600 AD, the Bodhidharma, who was, I believe, the 28th Buddhist patriarch in the direct lineage back to the Buddha, and considered the first patriarch of Zen, traveled from India to China. And once he arrived in China, the emperor at that time, Emperor Wu, was thrilled because for many, many years, he had been supporting Buddhism in China, funding monasteries, supporting the Sangha, allowing Buddhists to freely practice, without threat or violence, etc. And Emperor Wu thought he had actually accumulated quite a bit of merit. And in those days, there was this belief linked to karma that if you did really good things, that your karma would accrue to you as a form of merit, and that would result in good things happening in your life and probably a really good existence in your next life. So Bodhidharma comes and he meets with Emperor Wu, and Emperor Wu was like really excited because this is a true enlightened master from India. And he basically tells him all the things that he's done to support Buddhism. And he asks Bodhidharma a simple question. And so, having done all these things, what merit have I earned? And Bodhidharma said, no merit whatsoever. So the emperor was kind of like a little bit stunned. So, he said, well, okay, but what is the highest, holiest truth? And Bodhidharma replied, vast emptiness, nothing sacred. And this really stunned the emperor. He was a little bit flustered. He said, well, who are you then? And Bodhidharma looked at him and said, I don't know. And that ended the conversation. And Bodhidharma left. He crossed the Yellow River and he sat in a cave staring at a wall for 9 years doing zazen. So kind of what's going on here, right? It seems like you got these two individuals and they're having this conversation and it's like they're talking past each other. The emperor is on kind of one view of what's going on, and Bodhidharma seems to be answering in a very different way. Well, there's this great Buddhist writer, former ordained monk. His name is Stephen Batchelor, and he's written a number of really interesting books on Buddhism. But one of the books he wrote earlier on in his career was called Alone with Others, which was his attempt to show the parallels between Buddhism and existentialism. Okay. And in his book, he makes the comment that there are two words in the English language that are very powerful in determining how one lives their life. And one word is to have, and the other word is to be. And so if you're living a life of having, you're living a life feeling you're separate from other things. And your job in life is to kind of acquire things for yourself, for your family, for your community, if you're so inclined. So you have the right kind of job, and you have the right kind of relationship, and you have the right kind of friends, and you have the right kind of lifestyle, and you take the right kind of vacations, and you have the right kind of political views. And all this having determines who and what you are and how you are in the world. So that's kind of where the emperor was coming from. I've done all these things. I've created all these things. What merit has come to me? What have I gained from this, right? When Bodhidharma said, when he was asked, who are you? He said, I don't know. He was living the life of being. He was completely in the moment. And in that moment, if you look deeply within yourself, you won't find anybody. You won't find anybody. He was just being. So when he was asked, who are you? There was nobody to point to. I'll give you another kind of more modern version of this. There was this college professor who became very enamored of Buddhism. I actually know a college professor like this. And he trained, and I mean, not trained, but studied Buddhism, read text, even learned how to translate text. Became an expert, in academia, was asked and invited to come to conferences and give talks. And he had quite a reputation. He was kind of like, a big expert. And his dream was to eventually go to Japan and have an audience with a real Zen master, an enlightened master. And he finally got an opportunity on sabbatical, and he traveled to Japan, and he had an opportunity to meet this enlightened master in the monastery. And he came in, and the Zen master was sitting at this table, and there was a little pot of tea and a couple of cups, and he invited the professor to sit down, and the professor sat down, and he started just, kind of extolling all his ideas and concepts and, thoughts about Buddhism. And the Zen master just sat there, but he didn't really say anything, just sitting, listening. So eventually the professor kind of became a little mindful that he'd been talking quite a long time, and that the Zen master hadn't responded to a thing he said. And so he finally just kind of ran out of gas, became silent. And at that point, the Zen master said, "Can I pour you a cup of tea?" And the professor said, "Oh yeah, that would be lovely." And he holds out his hand. And the Zen master pours the hot tea and keeps pouring until it overflows the cup onto his hand. And the professor pulls his hand back and said, Why did you do that?" He said, "You came here to learn about Zen, but you're so full of your own ideas that nothing else can go in. First, you need to empty your cup." So one famous Zen master who founded the San Francisco Zen Center, his name was Shinryu Suzuki Roshi, wrote a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Okay. And in that book, he said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. Have you ever noticed that, in your lives, where you work, or, in your relationships with others? That the more people know, the more they tend to want to dominate the discourse. How many times have you sat in a meeting of 7, 8, 10 people, and 2 or 3 people are constantly dominating the discourse? Okay. I always found it interesting when I used to be an administrator in this large residential treatment center for kids, that new staff had the best questions, because they came in with this mind of not knowing, right? They were open. Their mind was kind of seeking new information. And they were the ones that most often suggested a change or maybe a slightly new innovation in what we were doing. Unfortunately, they were often met with fierce resistance from the people who knew what needed to happen, right? So some of you may be familiar with the teacher who essentially founded the lineage of the Zen Peacemakers back in the 13th century. His name was Eihei Dogen Zenji. And he left Japan and went to China for, I think it was about 6 years, and traveled around. It was either 3 years or 6 years. Traveled around, eventually met a true Zen master, attained enlightenment, and came back to Japan to share what he had learned. And he wrote this treatise called The Universal Recommendation of Principles of Zazen, which was kind of like a Zen manifesto, saying, all right, this is what the true Zen meditation is about. And I want to quote one of the things that he said in giving instructions to people who are going to learn this form of meditation. Once you have adjusted your posture, take a deep breath. Inhale and exhale. Rock your body right and left and settle into steady, immobile sitting position. Think of not thinking. How do you think of not thinking? Non-thinking. So what is non-thinking? It's not thinking. It's not thinking. It's non-thinking. Okay. Another example comes from the ancient literature. A monk asked Yao Shan, "What are you thinking in steadfast, immobile sitting?" Yao Shan said, "I think of not thinking." The monk asked, "How do you think of not thinking?" Yao Shan said, "Beyond thinking." And then finally, there was the famous Korean Zen master Sung Song, who was famous for his very pithy teaching. The most important being only don't know. Only don't know. Keep a mind before thinking. So non-thinking, beyond thinking, before thinking. What exactly are these statements pointing to? It's a little bit of a mystery. Well, there was a very famous teacher who founded well, he didn't found the monastery, but he practiced at a monastery in Japan called Antaji, where they worked mostly with Western students. And he wrote a book called Opening the Hand of Thought, where he very clearly explicated what the practice of not knowing in Zazen is about. So think about it like this, right? When you're sitting on the cushion meditating, do you stop breathing? No. Does your heart stop pumping? No. Right? Then why would we expect our mind to stop thinking? It's just natural, right? It's just natural. A lot of people have the mistaken idea that when they're doing Zazen, they're supposed to be able to stop all their thinking. And somehow when that happens, something amazing is going to happen to them and they'll never be troubled by their thoughts again. I mean, I'm playing it up a little bit here, right? But what Uchiyama Roshi was basically saying is that when you're sitting on the cushion and you're just paying attention to your posture and your breath, it is invariably true that you're going to have thoughts appear in your mind, right? So you ever see those like cartoons with a little cloud, right, that represents a thought, right? Ever see that? So that's just what's going to happen. You know, you're going to be sitting and you're going to be following your breath and a cloud will appear, right? It'll be some thought, right? And the practice of not knowing is simply noticing that the cloud, awakening to the fact that the cloud is there. You wake up to that, and then you just come back to your posture and your breath. It's literally that simple as a technique. Very hard to practice in one's actual experience, right? Something as simple as that. Just noticing your thoughts, awaking to that, and coming back to the moment over and over and over and over again. Opening the hand of thought, noticing it, coming back to your breath. That's the practice of beyond thinking, non-thinking, before thinking, okay? And the more time you spend here and the less time you spend there, interesting things start to happen. If you've been sitting for any length of time, you already know that. You already know what those interesting things might be, right? Okay. So one last comment about not knowing. Keeping this mind open, fresh, not fixed. Master Jizo asked Hogan, "Where have you come from?" "I pilgrimage aimlessly," replied Hogan. "Well, what is the matter of your pilgrimage?" asked Jizo. "I don't know," replied Hogan. Not knowing is most intimate, remarked Master Chizo. And at that, Hogan attained enlightenment. So when we're really bearing witness, completely present and open to the moment, the sense of I disappears because we're completely focused on the other. And that's a form of intimacy, is it not? When, when we're with our lover or our partner, you know what I mean? And we're very, just the two of us, and, we're together and we're crazy in love and we're feeling that, we often think of that as intimacy, and it is, right? But that feeling of intimacy is available to us at every single moment of our lives. If we can just get out of our heads and into our life, right? There's a joyousness there that's just waiting for you. It's just waiting for you to show up, right? Unfortunately, we're pretty much lost in the mind dream most of the time. And that's why we come to Zen practice, right? That's why we come to Zen practice. Okay, let's talk about bearing witness now. So, we talked a lot about not knowing. I hope that's clear. So a lot of people think that, Zen practice is mostly about sitting on a cushion and wearing robes and doing retreats and, doing interviews or doing koan study and, chanting and bowing and, all the things that we associate with Zen practice. Incidentally, a lot of that comes from Japanese culture, right? A lot of the things they do in Japan, they don't do in China. A lot of things they do in China, they don't do in Korea, and so it's only natural that as Buddhism and Zen evolves in this country, it's going to take on a very Western flavor, like it's taken on the flavor of other cultures where it has migrated to. But this idea, that sitting on a cushion is all about practice was really contradicted by the sixth patriarch. His name was Huining, and he basically said that Zen practice can be defined as the state of mind in which there is no separation between subject and object, no space between you and I. In other words, we're not separate. We're always in relationship, whether we realize it or not. And Bernie said, there's no space between you and me, up and down, right or wrong. And Bernie called this the practice of bearing witness. According to this definition, when we do Zazen, we bear witness to the oneness of life. So whether we're, cooking or taking out the garbage or driving our car, if we're doing it with the practice of not knowing, then we're bearing witness. And this is Zen practice. Now, Bernie got criticized a lot when he left California. He got Dharma transmission from Maizumi Roshi. Moved to California because he was originally from New York City. He started the Zen Center of New York in Yonkers, New York. And he was gifted this monastery, and they were doing a lot of that traditional kind of Zen training, which is what Bernie received from Maizumi Roshi. But then Bernie noticed that the Yonkers community, there was a tremendous amount of domestic violence and unemployment and poverty and drug addiction. And, becoming a dragon in Zen practice is the realization that the path forward is service to others. That once you realize that you're part of the oneness interconnectedness of life, you really don't have a choice anymore to be separate and stand by, be a bystander, and the deeper the realization, the more likely you're going to be engaging in more service with many people. And that's why Bernie developed the whole Greyston bakery idea. And in his bakery idea, he literally hired people right off the street in Yonkers, New York. He didn't care if they were poor. He didn't care, what their ideology was, what's their sexual preference was, whether they'd been in jail or not, completely not knowing, right, as part of his hiring policy. If you showed up at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning and you were the first 3 people in line and they needed 3 people, you got hired. That was it. Now that went against all conventional wisdom, right? It's like, you can't do that. That's crazy. That's nuts, right? Well, guess what? Within a year, they were making the best cheesecake in the entire city of New York. Think about that. It was actually served at the White House. And who were these people? They were society's throwaways. They were society, you can't work with those people. They're helpless. Forget it. They're addicts, they're prostitutes, they're horrible people. Pretty powerful. Pretty powerful. So one of the things that Bernie would, and the reason Bernie was able to do that is because he approached it with a mind of not knowing. He didn't care what their history was. All he cared about is, what are we doing right now? How are we going to be working together right now? Right. And he didn't try to fix them, which is very important. He didn't try to fix them. Oh, well, we'd love to give you a job, but you're going to have to be sober for at least a year before we could even consider you. There were no barriers to entry, right? Now, if you went in there and they had 2 weeks to kind of like fit in with the rest of the people who worked there, and it was kind of like a Japanese management model where, your place in the organization was dependent on your relationship with your peers and how well you worked together. And if they didn't work out, then, they were asked to leave. So it wasn't some Pollyannish thing that they were doing, right? So one of the things Bernie said, which I always found kind of inspiring, he said, when we bear witness, we become the situation: homelessness, poverty, illness, violence, death. The right action arises of itself. We don't have to worry about what to do. We don't have to figure out the solutions ahead of time. Compassionate action is the functioning of bearing witness. Once we listen with our entire body and mind, loving action arises. So think about that. Have you ever known someone that you kind of didn't like, but you're not exactly why? You just kind of viscerally didn't like the person. Maybe it was their clothes, maybe it was their demeanor, maybe it was some of the things they said, maybe it was a few things that you had heard about them. And for some reason or other, you actually get into a situation where you have to spend time with them. And you actually find out they're a pretty nice person. That they're not anything like you thought they were. But you had a certain fixed idea about how they were. But when you actually got into a relationship with them, the whole thing kind of changes. Not always for the better. So it's acknowledging, if we really believe that everything is interrelated, then the path to walk together is to get in relationship with each other. And when we do that, we are often able to figure something out, right? As opposed to, I'm the boss, you're not the boss. I've got it, you don't. You're going to listen to me. And if you don't, there'll be consequences. Okay. How much of that is so embedded in our daily life, right? Whether it's employment, relationships, you name it, right? And in many ways, Zen practice is so radical, to our current culture and the way that we've been conditioned to see and view the world. It's very countercultural, in that sense. So I'll give you kind of a little bit of a humorous example of bearing witness, right? So there was this Chinese enlightened master. His name was Lehman Pang, but he wasn't a priest. He was a layman, right? Anybody here ever hear about or read about Lehman Pang? Maybe. Okay. So he was widely known for his deep realization, and he had also worked, and his wife had become enlightened, and his daughter had become enlightened, and so they were very famous in Chinese culture. But they're obviously, very simple and very poor. So he made his living going around, picking things up and delivering them to people. And one day he was walking along the side of this bridge and he slipped and he fell down the bank. And I shouldn't laugh. And he's kind of laying there, right? And his daughter, Ling Chao, immediately runs down and throws herself on her back right next to it. Now imagine this, right? And Lehman Pang turns to her and goes, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm helping you. I'm helping you." Now she couldn't keep him from falling, right? And, he obviously wasn't hurt enough that he needed medical attention. But it's a beautiful example of she was just providing complete support. If you're laying on your back, I'm going to come lay on my back right next to you, and we'll do this together. That's a kind of an interesting little take on bearing witness, right? Bearing witness is like being the mirror that perfectly reflects everything that comes before it, right? A mirror doesn't care where you're from or what your religion is or what your beliefs are or how much money you make. It perfectly reflects everything that comes before it without prejudice, right? And that's bearing witness in its most, idealized fashion, so to speak, right? So sometimes, I'm a psychotherapist and I worked for the VA for many, many years, working with homeless veterans and suicidal veterans and veterans that were charged with criminal offenses. And my job was to basically work with them and find a way to keep them out of jail by offering them VA services and convincing the court that, we would support them such that they didn't need to, the district attorney didn't need to worry about them reoffending because we were going to wrap all these services around them. And in 7 years of doing that, a couple of hundred vets, I only had 2 that ever ended up incarcerated. Most of them ended up, accepting a plea deal and then taking responsibility and working through their issues. So it was amazing for me to actually do that in real life with real people who had real problems. But the only way I could do that is by continuing to use these 3 tenets. I'll give you an example. One of my veteran clients was probably the most well-known white supremacist in the entire state. I won't tell you the state because I wouldn't ever want to give away the person. And he had been a combat veteran. It also turned out that he had serious Asperger issues, right? And I don't know if you know much about Asperger's, but they can develop some very strange beliefs about things, particularly when it comes to relationships. And, when I had to hear and bear witness to all the things that he had said and reading his court documents, the fact that, he would show up at a community meeting where the state attorney general personally wanted him in jail. That's how much hatred there was directed at this individual. And I worked with him for probably 2.5 years, and eventually got a plea deal, so he didn't end up in prison. But during that 2.5 year process, we just simply had a relationship with each other. And in order for me to have that relationship, I had to put down my ideas about who he was or how, repulsive I thought some of his beliefs were. And he would share them with me. I wouldn't agree with them. I would just listen, right? But that's an example of how the 3 tenets can be applied in even some of the more difficult, seemingly extreme examples, right? I mean, it's one thing to lay down next to your dad because he's laying on a riverbank. It's another thing to accompany a well-known white supremacist to court and be, photographed and, quoted in the newspaper and, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway. Okay. One other quote here, and then we'll get on to the case. A couple more quotes. The point isn't to make ourselves holy when we're doing the 3 tenets. The point is to serve, to offer, to be the offering yourself, right? be the offering. You are potentially a gift to others. And when we are willing to be the offering, Ronnie had a great phrase, of itself, the fruit is born. Okay. So when we're having this mind of not knowing and we're bearing witness, paying close attention, in John Kabat-Zinn, when he defined mindfulness, he called it paying attention on purpose in a particular way without judgment in the moment. That's not a bad definition of bearing witness, in a way. So when we're present with someone and in relationship with them, it's amazing how the solution to a problem just appears, right? As opposed to, I already know what you need, and I have this to fix you. If any of you are in human services or mental health services, you know that approach almost always creates resistance, right? Almost always creates resistance. That top down, I'm the expert, you're the subject. So the Zen Peacemakers Three Tenets approach is much more open to, I'm not here to fix you. I'm not here to direct you. I'm here to be in relationship with you so together we can figure this out. And when we do that, it's amazing how often of itself the fruit is born. And we come up with something, and it may not work. But the cool thing about it is we came up with it together. And we're in relationship. And if it doesn't work, it's something we both did together. So now we try something else, as opposed to devolving into the blame game. You didn't really help me. You told me to do this, it didn't work, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that's it. Not knowing, bearing witness, loving action. Of itself, the fruit appears. So let's do a little exercise together. I've got a little case for you. And I'm going to describe it to you. And I want you to be thinking, and if you want me to repeat it, I will. I want you to be thinking about how these three tenets show up in this particular case. Okay. So there were these two Buddhist monks, Tenzan and Aikido. And at certain times of the year, these monks would go on a pilgrimage to another monastery to train with a different Zen master for a while. And they would always pair an older monk, in this case, Tenzan, with a younger novice monk, Aikido. And they, of course, this was ancient China, so they traveled on foot, and they would take a vow of silence in the morning when the sun came up. And they would keep their silence throughout the day. And then when the sun went down, they could converse with one another. So Tenzan and Aikido were traveling together down a muddy road, and a heavy rain was falling. Coming around the bend, they met a lovely girl in a silk kimono and sash, and she was unable to cross the intersection. Come on, girl, said Tenzan, the older monk. Lifting her in his arms, he carried her over the mud and set her down. And then they continued on their journey. Aikido did not speak until that night when they reached the lodging temple. So the younger monk is kind of like sensing, Tenzan, that he wanted to say something, but he couldn't speak because they had this vow of silence. So they finally get to the monastery, and Aikido says, I can't believe what you did, Tenzan. You picked that girl up and you picked her up in your arms. As monks, according to our vows, we're never supposed to touch a female. We're not even supposed to look at them. And you're my senior monk. Why did you do that? And Tenzan said, I put her down hours ago. Are you still carrying her? So, any thoughts on how the three tenets are showing up here? Chris?
I just want to say, I've heard this story before. I keep it in my mind quite a bit, so I really appreciate you sharing it. I'll just start maybe with one, but I think in terms of not knowing, just being, they're walking down the road and being open, right? They're just there in the moment.
Right. And was there anything about the way things unfolded that would indicate that either one of them is not practicing not knowing?
Not at the beginning that I can see, the conditions are what they are. It could have been a sunny day, could have been like it was muddy and rainy, but they were just on their journey
Okay.
in the moment.
Okay. All right. Other thoughts? Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Yes, Eduardo.
Hello, welcome. This is my first meeting
Okay.
I'm finding it very exciting and interesting. So yeah, I just came back from a session as well. So it's interesting to think about applying how we apply our practice and these tenets. I think the thing that occurs to me is that it's important that the senior monk, he actually does speak. So he let go of the preconceptions, like the rules that were in place, and he responds in the moment. So that I don't know if that's the bearing witness part. Responds to the moment in the way that the moment calls for. Obviously based on loving kindness and based on care. He lets go of all of the preconceptions of who he's supposed to be, what he's supposed to be doing, because that moment demands a response.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very good. Yeah, exactly. And how was the other monk different from him in terms of what he experienced when he saw Tanzan carry the young woman across the muddy road?
Oh, I'm glad to pass that second question on to the group. So
yeah. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yes, the young monk, it seems to me, was not in the space of not knowing. The young monk had preconceived ideas about how they should be behaving, whereas the older monk seemed to bear witness and then had a compassionate action that he actually instituted.
Yes, exactly. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's kind of the core piece of this, that keep in mind that these monks had like a couple hundred vows that they had taken, what they call the Vinaya, which are the priest vows. But the older monk understood that the precepts were not ironclad rules, right? That they're more like guidelines, that are under contextual control, Yeah, you shouldn't put your hands on a female. But what about the context of a female that's in distress and needs help? If you pick them up, are you violating that precept? And if you don't pick her up, there's a precept about helping, right? Are you violating that precept, right? And so when we think about these kind of rules, the older monk kind of is holding them lightly, right? He knows what the rules are. He knows them, chapter and verse. But he also knows the point of all those rules is to deepen their practice so that they can respond compassionately in every moment. Right? So when he sees this woman in distress, he doesn't even think about whether it's right or wrong or up or down. He just takes loving action. Think about the younger monk, he's mortified because, and this is true, right? When people first join something, they're usually really good about, showing their ability to fit in and be part of something, and we see that a lot with new Zen students, you know what I mean? But it also can sometimes reflect a rather rigid view of what the practice is. And in this case, the younger monk had a very, yet pretty much undeveloped idea of what the precepts really entail. And he was just going by the rule, right? Isn't it also interesting to notice that at the end, when Ikuto was finally able to speak, the younger monk, what was the first thing he did? He came out with a judgmental statement. He had judged Tanzan. And probably that whole day where they were walking for, 8, 12 hours, his mind was probably roiling, with this isn't right. And he's supposed to be, the senior monk, and I've been paired with the wrong person. And, this guy can't even, follow fundamental rules here. And he's supposed to be teaching me, et cetera, and then Tanzan says, "Oh, I put her down hours ago. Are you still carrying her?" Which made him realize that because he was lost in these judgments about what the older monk did or didn't do correctly, he wasn't even present for the entire day. He was lost in the rules, right? So that's the consequence of knowing fixed ideas that you hold to, despite the context, which would tell you, you don't need to do that in this moment, do this. And what guides that choice? What is the most compassionate thing I can do? Yeah. Other comments, questions, or concerns? I think we've got a few minutes left. Thanks, Kathy.
Mary Lynn's got her hand up. Go ahead, Mary Lynn.
Isan Dorsey, the book Street Zen
Yes.
is what I return to keep the humility, keep going under the door, as opposed to, it has brought me back to earth so many times because he just broke it all. He was in open defiance of so much, and it's a hard book to read in parts. It's hard to read about his life. There's another saint, Saint Martin de Porres in the Roman Catholic Church, was the same way, multiracial. Everybody called him a dog, mulatto dog. And he was one of the most compassionate. I just keeping these, I think those two outside of Zen, well, not Isan, but Saint Martin de Porres outside of Zen, keep me grounded so that I don't go outside of myself. And so that I stay in my sphere of where I can do something compassionate.
Yeah, Isan was very close to my teacher, Bernie Glassman. Bernie knew him, and they had a very close relationship. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, it's Bernie. That was Bernie. Okay, thank you so much, Mary Lynn. Anybody else?
I did, go ahead, Sam.
Hi.
Sam.
I just wanted to share that I really appreciate these three tenets because it's a much more contemplative practice for me, and less rigid rules that I then self-constrain. And these tenets, for me, feel that contemplation allows me to open up to whatever takes place. And I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, I think that's of itself the fruit is born. Right. Yeah.
I had a question just on a clarification. When you started, you said, as the three tenets, but you described them as cease from harm. I missed the middle one, and then do good for others.
Yeah, actually, Chris, I was describing what are called the three pure precepts.
Okay.
Yeah, which are, the tradition, part of the traditional 16 Bodhisattva precepts that one vows to follow once they become a formal Zen student.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
You're welcome, Chris. Thanks for coming today.
Well, it looks like we're getting to the end of our time here. Daikan, thank you so much for really a clear, calm, lucid explanation of this. We can get wrapped around the axle with these ideas sometimes, but you make it just very accessible. So thank you.